Hello and welcome. My name is Annabel McGilvray and I'm the Director of Communications with the AIIA. I'm here with Jacinta Carroll, the new Director of the National Security Policy at the National Security College at ANU. Thank you very much for joining me, Jacinta.
It's lovely to be with you, Annabel.
Now, your area of expertise is counterterrorism, and you've presented here at AIIA New South Wales on counterterrorism tonight. One of the main topics for discussion when it comes to counterterrorism at the moment, obviously, is what's occurring in Mindanao and Marawi in the Philippines. Perhaps you can talk to a little bit about what the risk is for Australia's national security of what's occurring there with the IS-linked insurgents.
Yeah, the Philippines is a really interesting one for us because it does seem like a shock, and certainly the Philippines government has said that they were surprised, and the city of Marawi itself, of course, was subject to a siege surprise attack by IS. What's very interesting for us, of course, is to see what does this mean in terms of our regional exposure to this form of terrorism, this ISIS-inspired brand of terrorism, and there are a few factors that fall out of it. One key one in the bigger picture is that the Australian government and other countries around the world have talked about and been very focused on the foreign fighter issue, not just foreign fighters going from our countries to the Middle East, but what happens when ISIS is defeated in the Middle East, which they effectively have been. The Iraqi government has declared victory over ISIS just this week. What happens to those fighters afterwards? A lot of the initial discussion talked about what happens if they come back, but in a country like Australia, it's actually quite difficult for anyone who's got a terrorist association to return and to be able to act with impunity. So while Australian citizens have a right of return, they mightn't be able. They'll probably face justice here. They probably won't be able to do what they want. So where else do terrorists go? Well, they go to where there's another conflict. They go to where there's other kudos. What we've seen with the Philippines is that ISIS itself has been saying for some time, for some months, the new form of the so-called caliphate is now in East Asia, and they've named this East Asian caliphate in the Philippines. So there's a couple of things for us. One is that this is the first time that this brand of ISIS has come in a focused and directed way, putting its resources, its technical knowledge, its planning knowledge, and we see its planning style, the ISIS playbook, really played out in Marawi. The Australian Prime Minister talked about it looking very much like a Raqqa in Syria. So this is this group now focusing on our region, and that's a different fight from what we'd seen in the Middle East. Our capable country neighbours, fairly good and engaged polity, but this one area of the southern Philippines, and there are some neighbouring parts of Indonesia and Malaysia where terrorist groups have been able to operate with some impunity. They can certainly move money, goods, people and so on in the area. We're seeing now that there is this focus. What is ISIS's intention in that area? Well, it's firstly to maintain its brand, obviously, but to have a new focus for other fighters to come from and to mount attacks. So the direct interest of Australia, of course, is what might be the Australian link, and historically Australian terrorists have had association in the Philippines, but also we have our own community. How would Filipino community in Australia, how might they be affected? How might their concerns be focused to what's happening in our neighbourhood? So there are a range of factors at play. Our regional stability and the impact of that safe haven creating, again, a focus for planning and exporting terrorism around our region is of concern. Indonesia effectively got rid of its terrorist threat over the last decade and a half and has really been in control of that, but this new reinvigorated form of extremism, plus the substantial money, the kudos that comes with being a foreign fighter, means that Indonesia, the place where most Australians have been killed in terrorist attacks, and our closest neighbour, is also being targeted by this. So we have domestic issues affected, potentially Australian foreign fighters and nationals being involved as enemy combatants in the region, and our very regional stability being affected. Another thing to note with this is that our region is quite different from the Middle East version of ISIS, because we can't expect, and we wouldn't expect, the rest of the international community to be as focused. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. European and NATO country interest in the Middle East is because of the proximity, a range of other factors. But also the capability of countries in the Asia Pacific means that we should be able to deal with this ourselves. So this is a different kind of focus, and it's one where we need to bring all things to bear, not just military, but our diplomatic effort, our humanitarian, and also just our understanding of how you transition something from a military conflict into a pathway for an engaged and inclusive community, because that's part of what will take away the attraction of ISIS for Filipino Muslims in Mindanao.
So, I mean, obviously there are some lessons perhaps we can take from our previous cooperation with Indonesia to the work that we may be able to do in the Philippines.
Yeah. The engagement with Indonesia is a great model. There's a lot of work that Australia and Indonesia have done jointly, notably, of course, the Asia Pacific Counterterrorism Finance Initiative. But also one thing that most are aware of is that fantastic engagement between the Indonesian police and the Australian Federal Police that came out of the Bali bombing, actually having to work together. And through that engagement, not only was Australia to be able to provide some training and some capability, but we've also learnt and enhanced our capability and understanding through that operation with their Indonesian colleagues. And the joint Jakarta Centre for Law Enforcement Cooperation isn't just a bilateral piece. This is a regional hub for police training, for investigative training, and also a forum for all practitioners around the region to come together to discuss issues and work together.
And so I understand this week the Defence Minister, Maurice Payne, is in Manila meeting there to look at what support perhaps Australia can provide from what's occurring on Mindanao. Is there, what practical support can we provide, do you think, to counter the terrorism risk in that region and what's occurring there now?
Yeah, one of the really interesting things about our current focus on the Philippines is that it provides an opportunity to highlight just how broad and deep that bilateral relationship is. Australia is actually the second largest provider of defence training and assistance to the Philippines and has a very long-standing defence cooperation program. The US is the number one provider, but Australia comes second. That might be a surprise to some Australians, but that just goes again to the heart of where we live in our region and the depth of collaborative arrangements and shared understanding of what needs to be done that we have here. Australia very quickly, after the siege of Marawi, provided some intelligence support. So there are the Air Force P3 Orions providing intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance support to the Philippine operations. The way that was done, the way the Defence Minister is engaging now with the Philippines is the right way, which is coming together as part of the region to engage with the Philippines and say, what do you need? What are you trying to do here? How can we help? So there was an initial early on support of that intelligence capability. One of the things that will be up for discussion, we're fairly sure this week, is whether Australia can provide Australian Defence Force personnel in the train, advise, assist role that they've done so well in Iraq with Task Force Taji in training Iraqis who have then gone into combat against IS, training them in urban warfare, learning from them together what is this thing, what is this type of the type of tactics used by this group ISIS. Both of those things, learning about urban warfare and dealing with ISIS, are exactly the types of capabilities that the Philippines have said that they are interested in. They're very, very good at jungle warfare. They're very good at dealing with the traditional communist insurgencies and Islamist groups, but this is a slightly different version of that. So they do need some assistance, and providing mature assistance to a capable partner is the right kind of thing to do. And this complements a range of other things that are going on. We see that Indonesia, Malaysia and the Philippines have started their joint patrols of the tri-border area, because you need to stop weapons smuggling and financing, all of those other supporting elements as well, not just engage in supporting that military conflict.
I guess you have mentioned before, and you mentioned in your presentation to AIIA New South Wales, that information has been a real source of strength the mechanics of information has been a real source of strength for terrorist groups. Perhaps you can talk a little bit to, what information tactics we're seeing perhaps out of the Mindanao area and the resurgence in Indonesia as well.
One of the things that ISIS does, which is just what all terrorist organisations do, is put information and propaganda, because it's not truthful information, but the messaging and the narrative of how the simple way they want to see the world that naturally leads to justifying everything that they're doing, particularly the violence. So what we're seeing in Mindanao is that ISIS have come in with their own agenda to keep the brand going, to have a place for people to go. And of course their resources and so on. But they've come into an area that actually has some ready-made base of local frustration. What ISIS has been able to do through local commanders, Hapilon and the Maute brothers in particular, is to identify a common cause that sits above all of those individual groups and do something that, quite frankly, the individual groups hadn't been able to do before, and that's to bring them together under a common cause. So what's important there from an ISIS propaganda point of view is branding everything that's going on in the Philippines and in Mindanao as being an IS thing. A simple way of thinking about it from an Australian perspective is Manharon Monis, the Lint Cafe siege perpetrator. Regardless of the active debate in Australia about his real motivations and so on, ISIS proclaim him as one of their soldiers. So what actually happens on the ground with him, what his motivations and his knowledge were, wasn't relevant. He's just part of advertising their brand. The same in the Philippines, picking up that local cause and saying the grievance that you have with Manila isn't just a local one, it's this particular extreme form of Sunni Islam. Some of my research colleagues who focus on Southeast Asia have said that for the first time in many of these countries in Southeast Asia where there are vibrant Muslim communities, for the first time there's an identifier between Sunni and Shia as being different and incompatible. That didn't exist significantly in Southeast Asian Muslim communities. So you have this imported version of Islamist extremism trying to take over and reshape some of the local dialogue. And of course, local Muslims in Mindanao know that that's not exactly the way their situation is, but some are frustrated by the peace process with the former groups, MNLF and MILF, and others see that, well, this is just a good thing to be involved in and it's giving us something. So that getting that nice link between the information idea to loosely link and acknowledge the grievances or the cause that's put forward, whether it's warranted or not, by the locals. The important message for the Philippines, and I think Australia can play an important role in this, is identifying in the heat of this military-focused conflict that the people we're dealing with are Filipino citizens, and ultimately the way to deny this group ever having a foothold is to ensure that they know that they're being looked after. And that's coming from Manila. Manila is the one that will protect and will provide, they should provide loyalty to, not this other group that's seeking to divide them.
Thank you very much for your time, Jacinta.
My pleasure.
If anyone else would like more information about international affairs, please go to the AIIA website, internationalaffairs.org.au.